So I believe we need to start with this second paragraph. That is number 6 in my, I have given every paragraph a number just for easy reference. What we talked about was what you might call the scientific task that he sets before him. That's paragraph 1 to 5. So the first subchapter, and then we get this one. The element of truth, going from 6 to 16. If you have a PDF version, you might find it helpful to give numbers to the various paragraphs. By the way, that is, in my experience, the best way to study Hegel. In order to get to what I would call the flow of the argument. It's very difficult to find the flow of the argument in a text written by Hegel, because the literary dictates of the time didn't allow people to do it like that for some reason. So the paragraphs were very at random, were made at random. Simply stop somewhere or deal with one topic at length. We have a different method of constructing our paragraphs, and then numbering the paragraphs, and then writing a summary of that paragraph in one sentence. And then you have a whole list of sentences that are the summary of that, and that's more easy to read and to explain and to get to something like the flow of the argument. What actually is a scientific system? What is philosophy as a scientific system? Well, it doesn't have to do with experience or with detailed inquiries into the nature of things. It doesn't concern the how and the what and the where and the when of normal reality. It goes one step back. That's the result of the Kantian revolution in philosophy, that all of us, when we approach reality, speak about reality, discuss experiences, we have a set of categories that's already in place that we use to approach reality. And we're never without such a thing. Even a simple awareness of light without any particular content. Even such an awareness has a specific category attached to it. It has language and something conceptual already in there. There seems to be some kind of priority of our thinking processes, a priority above experiences. We never receive raw data that we then try to analyze and to give some shape. That was the contention of the English empiricist movement, that's how it worked. Our senses got some kind of impressions, and then our brain was able to combine impressions, sort them out, analyze them, see differences, and see consistencies, etc., to figure out what was going on. And then, and only then, we needed words or concepts to express our experiences. That's the empiricist idea. Against that was the rationalist idea that we have all these wonderful concepts and that we don't need experience at all to understand reality, because reality is fully expressed in the concepts that we use. So an empiricist would say, let's say with the concept of life, well, we need to figure out what is contained in that word. So we need to find living things and discover variations and different ways life works, and then that all of that we can summarize with the word life. But it's about the experiences, it's about the single things that are living. And the rationalist would say, well, let's examine what we mean with the word life. then we know everything we need to know about life. The rest is accidental. I mean, we know about life when we know about the basic characteristics of life: procreation, consumption, the sociality of living things. We know that. Oh, well, that's all we need to know, at least in philosophy, that's all we need to know. The rest is up to the biologists to discover exactly how these living things are operating, how they're named, what their color is. That's all very accidental and less important. For Hegel, however, the concept is not simply something rational, and it isn't something that comes later and is merely, let's say, a word that we use to summarize a whole lot of experiences. So he's neither a rationalist, concept itself as a pure rational thing doesn't tell us anything, nor is he an empiricist. He's not going to say that the concept merely describes or summarizes a whole lot of experiences. Actually, the concept is defined as the identity of thought and reality. The concept expresses reality, so in that sense they are to be identified. It's reality in the form of the concept. But also you can say reality is a realization of the concept. It's the actuality of what is potentially within the concept. So you can look at it from both ways. The empiricist will stress the reality as distinct from the concept. The rationalist will stress the concept as distinct from reality. And an idealist, Hegelian, will stress the identity between the two. After all, I cannot speak about reality without using concepts. There is no way to escape from the conceptual nature of my knowledge. And that is not simply the way humans need to go about it, the way human beings know something. According to Hegel, that is because reality itself is conceptual. Let's say if we talk about the concept of life, we have these characteristics of life. Why do we have a concept like that? Well, because living things show these characteristics. It's in reality. So the concept is not merely something subjective on our side. It's actually there. It's in reality. Those distinctions that we make, we don't make within our own heads. They are actually in reality. All of that is my introduction to his statement, which is far more elegant and simple. The element of truth is the concept, in its true form, the scientific system. So what we're going to see in the whole of Hegel's philosophy, the phenomenology being the introduction to that whole system, that is the exposition of the content of the concepts that we use. Starting with the most immediate concept that seems to simply refer to a whole of experiences, up to and including the ultimate shape of the concept, which is the idea in the logic, spirit in the phenomenology, the absolute in metaphysics. Well, you can call it in different ways, and Hegel does call it differently in various parts of his system, but it's the same. It's the full developed and exposited identity of thought and being. They are actually the same. Correct thinking is also reality. I mean, there is illusionary thinking, has nothing to do with reality, and there is reality that is merely, well, not even perceived, but imagined, and they are excluded. But true reality and the concept, they are actually one and the same. You might say reality is the actuality of the concept, and you could say the concept is the ideality of reality. There are all sorts of ways to express this in a very abstract manner, but the proof of the pudding is really in the eating, to show that that is the case, to prove that thought and reality are identical. That's what Hegel tries to do. And at first it sounds a bit silly. Thought and reality are the same. Especially Marxists have always laughed at that statement. But that is because they didn't understand what Hegel meant by that. Okay, so that's his first position. If we want to have a philosophy that is more than just a bunch of opinions, if we want to have a philosophy that truly expresses reality as a whole, then we need to discover that truth within the concepts that we use, the language that we... So some people say it's more than just the concept, it's also the entire, well, language that we use. And language is more than a tool. Language is the way in which this identity of thought and being actually works itself out. All our words that we use to refer to reality are at the same time expressions of that reality, or something is contained in these words that is an expression of reality. You might even see it like this: there is no truth, there's no reality beyond and above the human experience of it. That's simply a given. If there were no human beings, reality wouldn't be reality. There would be something, somehow, somewhere, sometime, but you can't call it reality. As soon as you use a word to apply to that, let's say we call it the universe without human beings, well, we have used the concept. And we have used the word without. We have used language to describe such a thing. A world without human beings, well, wouldn't be a world, because the word world implies existence of human beings who can call it that. So it's impossible to imagine a reality without human beings. More strongly even, reality cannot exist without human beings, because there needs to be an observer. There needs to be someone, something, someone who is able to grasp that reality. You can't leave that to animals or plants. They're not aware of reality. They live in reality, they respond to something real, they're part of that reality, but they don't reflect on or are aware of the reality as such. Now, all of this is just a prelude, because Hegel doesn't want us to take these minor steps to approach his system. He wants us to simply go along with his thinking. I don't think he would approve of my attempts to make it seem more reasonable by giving you these statements. He would, I think, reject that as a bad philosophical or unphilosophical introduction to philosophy, because he would say you cannot start philosophy by being unphilosophical. The only way to be a philosopher, to act like a philosopher, is to do philosophy, and that is to rethink what he is claiming here is a philosophical statement, just to rethink it, to go into it, to become aware of its meaning, to let it resonate within you, and then you move on. And there's no position outside of philosophy by which you can measure philosophy or criticize philosophy. You have to get into it. That was one of the major appeals to me of Hegelian philosophy, this high standard of doing philosophy. Well, if you want to do philosophy, there's no preparation for it. Start. And then, of course, after having said such things, he wrote a preface anyway. I believe maybe his publisher demanded it. I mean, you can't leave people without any kind of idea what you're going to do. Write a preface. Okay, sir, he did. And he wrote that before he even finished the whole of the work. Usually you write a preface at the end when you're done, but he didn't. And that is why not all of the Phenomenology is somewhere to be found within the preface here. And the preface was actually not just for the phenomenology. It was meant for the entire threefold system of the phenomenology, and then the philosophy of nature, and then ultimately the philosophy of spirit. That was his first design of his system. But then when he was writing the phenomenology of spirit, something completely different came out. Much larger than was intended. He intended a 200-page introductory work, and it turned out to be an 800-page systematic philosophy in its own right, and not just an introduction. So that is very interesting for understanding the whole of the work. But we're going to look, for the most part, in the coming weeks at this first construction, this first idea that he had, that the phenomenology would be an introduction to the whole system. And this is the first thing he says. The element of truth is the concept, and is true from the scientific system, which is very, very, very true for, let's say, the science of logic, for even the philosophy of nature. And it sort of is in tension with what he actually does in the phenomenology. But we'll come to that when we start reading about sensuous awareness. Now that belongs to the, let's say, higher problems in reading Hegel, but let's first get to know simply his intent here. Yeah? So at some stages I will simply stop and ask you, do you have a question or a remark? Or?
Yeah, for here I have a question that's very like about the whole thing, because I tried, as long as I read his passage, to to try to find what he means with a spirit or Geist. Is it really the spirit that classic religion meant, or it just like psyche or mind?
No, neither of those. He looks at the whole of reality and he says, what is the most defining characteristics of the totality of being, the whole of reality? And then he says something very weird, maybe. He says, well, the fact that that reality to some extent knows itself. Now, that reality, parts of that reality are not self-conscious and are writing books, but there is a part of reality that does so, humanity, and he says the whole of reality comes to a sort of self-awareness within humanity. We are the ones who are conscious of ourselves, but not just of ourselves, but also we are aware of the whole of reality. And that fact that the whole of reality is known by us, is known through us, in a way knows itself through us, that is what he calls spirit. So the fact that reality as a whole has some kind of self-awareness, even though that is restricted to what human beings are doing in actuality. Let's say Hegel, writing a book on the meaning of reality as a whole, is not just one person trying to figure out the rest of the world. It's the world itself trying to figure out itself. It's like a pyramid. So you have the whole of reality, unconscious, not being aware of itself, at the bottom. But then the high point of the pyramid, the absolute or the spirit, that is the point where that reality has some kind of self-reference, has some kind of reflection of itself. To what extent and when and where does an insect, is an insect aware of itself? Well, not as an insect. It has no self-awareness. But because we know about insects, we discovered so many things about insects, we have this concept of being an insect. You can say, well, that is just one of our concepts, but Hegel will say, no, that is the reality of the insects within us coming to some kind of self-awareness. Maybe that's a matter of language, maybe that's something very important about reality, but that is what he means. So he's not talking about a separate entity called God or anything like that. These idealists were sometimes accused of being atheists. They talked about God all the time, but that didn't help them much. They were called atheists because they didn't insist on the separation between God and creation and the independence of something like God. God wasn't an independent being, even though in Christianity and all other religions he was seen to be someone who was independent. No, Hegel said what we call God is simply the self-awareness of the whole of reality, going even above and beyond our, let's say, our individual humanity. Yeah, does it make sense? Does it help you a bit understanding that?
As I understand here, it's just, so you're saying that in Hegel's idea, there is just one spirit, or every person has his own or her own spirit?
Sure, the human mind is also, let's say, one and many at the same time. That's a very old classic philosophical idea that's trying to make us understand something very peculiar about our thinking processes. Every time I think, and Descartes was the one who stressed that, I'm aware of the fact that I am thinking. There's always this point of reference in my thoughts. Everything I say, I can add to that, I think that. So let's say I'm saying it's 5 o'clock. I think it's 5 o'clock. If I say there's a tree in my garden, I think there's a tree in my garden. So there's always this individuality of thinking. However, let's look at the contents of my thinking. Words like tree and 5 o'clock and whatever I'm thinking, they have a universal meaning. That is to say that if you tell me that it is 5 o'clock, it means exactly the same as when I say it's 5 o'clock. You are doing thinking completely separate from mine. And yet we have this content that I can understand and you can understand. It's the same content. So it doesn't matter when you talk about the content whether you or I are thinking it. That doesn't make a change. So there is at the same time an individuality and a universality to our thought, to our thinking processes. So there is one human mind, you might say, one thing we share, and although we share all of that, we are also individualized. There's a difference between stating that everyone is an individual and saying that every one of us is an individualized form of the universal mind. And Hegel tends to say, well, look at the way we use the word I think. I think doesn't have any content, and the content is universal. We can understand each other in language. We use the same concepts. So what does this I really mean? Is it a given that we are completely separate individuals, or is it a given that we are one, that we have one mind, but each of us has an individualized form of that?
Mm-hmm.
It depends on what you would give priority. Descartes would give priority to the fact that I am the one thinking, and he would point at himself. But then his ultimate find, the thing he discovered is something really universal, because everyone can actually do his thought experiment and come to the same conclusion. I think, therefore I am. It's at the same time completely individual. I have to do that. I have to think that. And completely universal, because everyone is an I that can do and think that. The only thing that is peculiar to me, which makes me a separate individual, is unimportant things like the length of my legs or the color of my skin or some other thing that is completely, let's say, completely unimportant as far as thinking goes. which, by the way, leaves absolutely no room whatsoever for whatever kind of discrimination or racism you might think of, even for those forms that were still rampant in Hegel days. This discovery of the universality of the mind and the fact that most of the traits and characteristics that we divide people by, such as color of skin, etc., or language or cultural background, in Hegel's mind are completely unimportant, or rather they are part of something very positive, and that is each of those brings out the variety that is within humanity. So he has a very positive position toward, let's say, racial, social, gender differences or whatever. He never, never in a completely modern manner, but still it's there. It's there in his philosophy, and I like that very much. It's about citizenship. Citizenship has nothing to do with color or with whatever character. Citizenship is what makes us universal and individual at the same time. So he talks about that in his philosophy of right. But back to the logic and to philosophy again.